Greetings, Fred in Alaska. Thanks for joining me today. Opening, instead of the time-lapse footage, I put up some of the images from the auroras last night. And honestly, the pictures do it no justice. When you're standing underneath those auroras and there's just ribbons of color dancing, it's beyond words. So what I want to share with you today comes from Bailey and her younger brother Brian. Bailey works in the medical field, only comes up to Alaska about 4 times a year. This happened during her fall trip. The trip before this last fall was in the spring, and she went with some friends to the Resurrection Trail, and they only hiked up a part of it. Now that trail runs from Girdwood Indian area on through over towards Eagle River. And her initial trip with a couple of co-workers, they did a little day hike. They put not a lot of effort into it, but she really enjoyed how beautiful it was. And so when she got back to her home state, she was bragging, and her younger brother was like, I'd love to go and see that. And so she was like, well, next trip, you know, it's coming up in 3 months. You know, they made their arrangements and they came up. Now, when they started their trek, there was supposed to be 4 people going. 2 people had to back out. So her brother had brought a firearm. He had a .44 Magnum. It was a lever action rifle, and they felt comfortable. You know, she had been up to Alaska several times, seen bears. I'm not super well versed, but had some experiences, so they were confident. It's a well-marked trail, and they were confident that they would not have any issues, especially with a firearm. Now, they started their journey, and they were moving kind of slow. Now, if you press yourself, you could probably do the journey in a day. They planned it out for 2 to 3 days just to make an adventure of it. Bailey's brother Brian is approximately 10 years younger, so they were going to use it as some bonding time, because, you know, she left early for college and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it was going to be some family bonding. Well, halfway through the first day, they kept hearing a very sharp whistle, but it sounded like it was coming way far in front of them. But it always sounded the same. It had the same strength and tone to it, the same loudness, the same volume. It was identical each time they heard it, so it sounded like it was just at a distance. And they thought it was a weird whistle, but they thought maybe, you know, there's search and rescue personnel doing maneuvers in there, doing some kind of training, and they were hearing that whistle. So they easily just dismissible and chalk it up to something else. Now, as it was getting on into dusk, they realized they were getting to a portion of the trail where it wasn't necessarily super hard. There was just change of altitudes up and down with all these different types of steps in the rocks and stuff. So they picked a spot off to the side of the trail there, because basically you're going through a valley when you're going in through there. And so they picked a little spot off to the side, and they set up their tent in a nice little grove of black spruce and a little bit of willows, and they felt comfortable. They weren't using any campfire or anything like that, and they were cooking some mountain meals, dehydrated, you know, boil up in a pot type stuff. So they were sitting there, and Brian had the rifle case out. He didn't have the rifle out, and as they were sitting there talking, they heard the whistle again. This time it sounded like it was up across the little valley from them and off to their left, but it was still very, very sharp whistle. Simultaneously with the initial whistle, there was a slow groaning and winding up like an air raid siren type of scream, as she described it. It worked up in volume from real low and arced on up to the highest pitch, where they were both literally covering their ears, because being in that valley, it was just like reverberating. And they were thinking to themselves, they had saw like 3 separate groups of people that just hiked on past them. They were getting on their business. So they were like, initially they were like, I wonder if some of those people were playing a joke, you know, because they were sitting there, they were trying to eat their food, but there was something about what they heard that just made them super uncomfortable. So they couldn't quite pinpoint it. They knew nothing about the Alaskan hairy man. They didn't even subscribe to any Bigfoot stuff before this. They were clueless. And so they finished up eating, and they were nervously laughing and making jokes. Oh, the monster's gonna eat us, you know, the Alaskan monster, whatever it is. They were literally joking around and just trying to break that nervous energy, which I understand. Just cracking senseless jokes and whatnot, and kind of talking about old times. And about a half hour had gone by. She's guesstimating, because it was getting on into twilight and about to get, you know, really dark really soon. And as they were having their discussions, after that scream and what have you, roar, scream, whatever you want to call it, air raid siren sound, Brian did open up the case and made sure that the gun was loaded and ready to go, because they just didn't know if it was a prank or anything else. So they were very honestly, they didn't know what to do. And those are her words. So as they're sitting there and discussing, like I said, about half hour time had passed by, they started hearing this grunting sound. And the grunt was a very guttural, deep, very loud for how low it was, and it came from the same direction that they heard this air raid siren scream. And so immediately they're both on their feet, and they're like, man, that must be a big bear, you know, because again, they clueless about anything hairy man, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever. They were just clueless. And as they were talking, it was getting louder and sounded like it was getting closer. And as it was getting closer, this is a continuous thing. It wasn't no alternating. They'd hear a sound, then a noise, or what. It was continual. They hear a grunt, growl, some movement, stuff breaking, another grunt, growl, movement, stuff breaking. Now she was guesstimating, and she's not a hunter. She knows nothing about yardage, but she was guessing a few hundred yards away across a little valley, working its way down essentially towards them, towards the trail where they were. And so they listened to this for a few moments, and they could tell it was progressively getting closer, and not up on them, but close enough to where they're like, screw this noise. Brian has the gun, and she's like, well, hey, just grab your day pack, I'll grab my day pack, let's back down the trail. They grabbed their little flashlights and stuff. He had the firearm, and they started backing down the trail. And as they were doing so, they were trying to minimize how much they used the light. They were worried about whatever this was seeing their light source and, you know, zoning in on them, zeroing in on them. And so they were backtracking. They would turn around and look, and as they were going along, this thing was gaining, per se, because they weren't moving as fast as it was. So it went from the low grunting and the snapping of branches to a whooping sound. She said the whooping wasn't initially scary. It was the whooping in return a little further down, and it sounded like it was coming from the trail area down at the bottom of the little valley. And so the whooping was almost the same tone, but the return whoop was lower or higher in pitch and not as deep. And she said at that point, it sounded like the movement stopped, but the noises continued in the area they were. So they continued backtracking quietly. They were trying to minimize their flashlight, so they were kind of cupping the beam and just kind of making sure they could see their feet, right? Not necessarily super treacherous in that area, but when it's dark in a valley up here, forget it. It goes pitch black real fast. And so they get to a point in the trail where there's some little rock spires off to they're coming back. So on their way in, it was on their left. On their way backtracking, it was on their right. And these spires of rock just sat out of the ground about maybe 6-7 foot. And on the back side, plenty of people have gone up and, you know, up there, because there's a small cluster of some willows and a couple black spruce or whatever. So they decide they're going to go up there, get a little high ground, because they didn't feel comfortable backtracking in that dark. They were already a few miles in, and they didn't know the trail all that well, and it was just so dark. They get up there, and they kill their lights, and they're sitting there, and they're whispering to each other. And meanwhile, while this is going on, there's still some whooping, some grunting, and some other weird noises she couldn't even put into words going on, just, you know, as her guesstimate, you know, less than a couple hundred yards away. and it was continuing from one spot and then a response from the other. Then they started hearing this garbled type sound, which she said she looked into it. It wasn't like the samurai sounds. It sounded more less Asian, more American Indian like, right? And again, that's all the clarification she had on that, because it was so new and different to her. She didn't have anything to relate it to. So they sat there listening to it, and as they were talking to each other about what in the hell can this be, it's got to be a prank, I don't know what this is. As they're whispering to each other, the louder noise that was, she said, sounded more aggressive. Another high-pitched scream comes from that area, and just breaking and thrashing. She wasn't sure what was being broken. She can only assume trees, but on that particular part where it was coming from, it wasn't dense. It was dense with brush, but not so dense on that side with a bunch of trees to be just breaking all over the place. So she was confused about that. You know, she wasn't sure what to think of it. And as this thing was coming their way, got louder, more thrashing, more breaking. They could barely make out the tinge of the, they had one of these neon nylon tents, little dome tents from REI. She said it was a neon, like yellow green, and it had the REI logo on the fly or whatever. And they could barely, because of its color, they could make out where it was, and they could see the top of it from where they had slowly backtracked away. She guesstimated they made it about 80 yards from where they were camping initially. And again, she could be off. She doesn't have her yardage or anything. She's not a hunter or anything. So as they were sitting there, they were looking back towards it, and they were whispering, and they saw this dark figure on, it was, the only reason they knew it was on two legs is because it was blacker than the darkness there, and they could see it moving. And then all of a sudden they see their tent fly across the trail, and then a scream, and then some thrashing around. And they were like, oh crap, that is huge. Because they saw how big it was in relation to their tent. And she said, she's not certain, she said it had to have been over 10 foot tall. This thing started screaming louder and started coming beelining up the trail, very aggressive walking, like a stalking walk, just kind of she felt like she was in a horror movie, because this thing was moving very deliberately and very aggressively. They could feel the energy off of it was very aggressive. So they didn't know what to do. Brian's sitting there, and he's like, he's whispering to Bailey, if it gets close, I'm gonna have to shoot this thing. It is huge. And again, Brian's not a firearms expert. That 44 would have done him not much good, but he was armed. And so as they're discussing, she's telling him, be quiet, we'll just be quiet and sit right here. Now they're on that little spire about 6-7 foot off of the trail. She said this thing, before it got to them, they could smell it, and it smelled like dead rotten meat and real strong urine smell, and the weird musty kind of scent to it. And she said it walked up the trail, and meanwhile her brother is trying to put a bead on this thing, and she lowered the barrel and whispered, don't unless it tries to hurt us, right? So Brian, they're both shaking. They're scared to death because this thing was big. It was pitch black. They couldn't make out any features, but they could see it on two legs, only because of what they were dealing with. It was darker than the darkness around them. And so as they're watching this thing, she said it came up the trail, got parallel with them on the trail, turned its body. They saw it was wide and taller than them, as it was 6-7 feet below. So she didn't know size, but she said it was well over 10 foot tall, and it stood there facing them about less than 12-15 feet away, she's guessing. Again, not an expert with distance. And they just sat there, and they were both quivering at that time and sobbing a little bit because this thing was so menacing standing there. Now she said it was weird because when they were sitting there and started sobbing, it was almost like the energy changed. She said it came across more like non-aggressive, but more of a curious type of energy. Her words, not mine. And so they just sobbing, and finally after a few moments, she said she wasn't sure exactly how long, it turned around and walked back down the trail and off into the darkness. There was some whistles and whoops after that. There was another scream or two, but again, she was in a terrified mode, and I understand that one. So a lot of the noises, she only picked up a couple of them, but she said there was definitely other noises going on. And this thing moved away, heard whoops from a different direction. She wasn't sure how many, but at least one more. And then it went dead quiet. And she said they sat there until sunrise, until it got twilight enough. They went back to their camp. The tent was on the other side of the trail. Most of their stuff was still in their day packs. Their foodstuffs were untouched. The little benzo stove or whatever was tipped over. The fuel can was still had a little bit of flame going on it, but it was virtually undisturbed, as far as like this thing wasn't kicking that around or anything like that. It just kind of, she said, looked like it grabbed the tent and flung it across the trail. There was only sleeping bags and just little minor stuff in the tent. So they claimed their stuff real quick. She said it was still dead quiet in that moment. They gathered up the stuff, kind of balled up the tent, stuffed it in whatever they could, and backtracked out of there back towards the Girdwood side where they had initially started. And I want to thank Bailey for sharing that. It was really hard for her because it's all new to her, and she tried to reach out to a couple other BFRO, I guess, or something else to leave a report and whatnot, and it got heavily edited and then deleted or something like that. And I was like, well, I appreciate you reaching out to me. And you know, it's hard, especially when these things aren't supposed to exist and you're dealing with this thing feet away. Like it's hard to even quantify into words, but not a fun day. She's due back up in Alaska for her quarterly whatever, and she agreed, if she's feeling it, she agreed to be interviewed, and I hope it works out that way. That'd be great. I always encourage those to share in their own words if they would, and a lot of people unfortunately are like, well, I like the way you tell the story better, so it is what it is. So I want to thank you, Bailey, for sharing that. I know it was hard for you. I hope it gets easier since you did share it. I'm sure if you look in the comments, people are very supportive on the channel. You know, it's not the kind of channel where people are going to be, you know, mocking you or anything like that. That doesn't happen here. Pictures of the auroras, I've sent a bunch off to Dave the Tech Guy. Check the website. Those should be posted. And thank you, little cousin Ryan. My little cousin Ryan donated a large group of those photos. The first one in the lineup, though, was one taken by Miss Hillary in Anchorage with the red in it and stuff. Just gorgeous pics. I'm telling you, the auroras are just beautiful, especially if you can witness them in person. It is a spiritual experience. Even if you don't believe in God, you want to take the scientific route about the sun rays and blah 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 bouncing on the atmosphere, that's fine. But when you witness it in person, you know it's more than that. Just saying, in my opinion. Again, thank you, Bailey and Brian, for sharing, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.